Okay, I've got some people watching. I'd like to just maybe put some comments or a thumbs up in the comment section as I'm familiarizing myself with Facebook's live streaming. Please feel free to do that so I know who's on, if you can hear me, if everything is going okay before I continue on my merry little way and just continue talking. So I'm just going to wait a few moments to see who else will join me or join us. So I hope everybody is well where you are coming in from. I'm just trying to find out how to access comments or questions or anything like that. Maybe that's a bit too hard for a Friday evening. So I'm going to commence at 7 o'clock here in South Australia. Welcome, my name is Frances Billinghurst and I am the author of Encountering the Dark Goddess, A Journey into the Shadow Realms. Before, excuse me, I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Ghana country, and as such I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land from which I am live streaming from, and in doing so I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So welcome to the Dark Goddess. I'm beginning to see some comments. Thank you, Natasha. Hello and welcome. And Anna, thank you. I can see now and now know where all the comments are coming from. Fantastic. So, as I said, my name is Frances Billinghurst. This is my, I won't say pride and joy, but something I've been working on for the last 10 years, which was produced this year in March through Moonbooks. So it's now available anywhere. You should be able to get it online through Amazon or Indie or whatever online bookshop, Dip the Mix, whatever you get it from, various markets, various bookshops around the country, and also through me and my Luna Noir Etsy store. I am also an author of a few other books, in particular and this is actually coming up, and this is the latest one, coming up for the 10th year anniversary of this book, which is about the Sabbaths and the seasonal festivals in the Southern Hemisphere. So next year will be the 10th year since that book was published, so I don't know where the time's gone. And I've done a few other books. Contemporary Witchcraft is my latest one, which was released at the beginning of this month, again through Moonbooks. So that's my second book through Moonbooks. I've also redesigned the cover for In Your Sacred Name, which is a collection of essays that I've written, an anthology about the god called Call of the God, because I work in polarity, and I've just done a little book of Wicca or Contemporary Witchcraft, which is sort of a precursor to Contemporary Witchcraft. But enough about that. Let's talk about the Dark Goddess. And hello, Jan. So the comments, but we will just leave it and continue. Me and modern technology don't always go hand in hand. So why don't we start off with my interest. How did I get interested in the Dark Goddess in particular? So I guess it sort of stems back to my relationship with the goddess to start off with, the divine feminine, and that commenced probably in about the early 1980s when I first discovered that there was such a thing, moving more from the myths and seeing them, or understanding that these myths were actually based on an element of truth. So when I came to Australia in 1990, I began studying a variety of mythologies and other ancient cultures. Along the way, and I guess my interest in the darker aspects of divinity sort of stemmed from the early 2000s. Now, if you sort of a bit of an old hand like myself, who's been around sort of the pagan scene for at least 20 years, if you can cast your mind back to the late 90s, early 2000s, it was sort of, I don't know, a bit love and light that was sort of depicted out there. And so, without being too, I don't know, detrimental or negative towards people, sort of, and my understanding of deity to start off with was never light or dark. It just is. And yeah, and I suppose maybe in a way it was a bit of a rebellion to the child that's fallen over and everything will be all right, and they're there, you know, all the nasty demons or life experiences will dissolve. And it's quite ironic because today, especially within witchcraft, there seems to be quite an opposite has happened. This love and light has been replaced with the sort of a diabolical or reactionary sort of aspect of witchcraft, which seems to focus on the collection of skulls and cursing, and that's also led on to an almost sort of, I don't know, somewhat paranoia, where everybody's needing to do protection circles and throw salt around and crush up eggshells, and all this works because, I don't know, maybe what they're putting out is coming back to them. So they're living on this sort of fear factor, or, as I said, paranoia in relation to cursing and negativity. But that thousands where the goddess was very secrete, sort of love and light depicted. And if anybody knows anything about mythology, there's a lot of myths that sort of depict a different aspect to her. And again, it's a bit difficult to talk about in a way because it all depends on, and just seeing the comments come up. Hello Jenny, help you well in Tassie. So everybody's going to have their own interpretations about who or what a dark goddess is, and my book is my interpretation. As I said, I come from in particular a tradition within witchcraft which believes or perceived divinity largely depends. And I've written some notes, and that might be a little bit, make more sense a little bit later on. But first, I just want to maybe talk a little bit more about who is actually the dark goddess. Is she simply just some terrifying demoness that we see in the Hollywood blockbusters, or is there more to her than just a figment of our imaginations and our nightmares? And just an aside, I've sort of been providing workshops which formed the foundation to Encountering the Dark Goddess since about 2006, largely looking at the myths, because I don't know, blame my mother, she was always interested in mythology, my father was as well, and I've always had this deep passion for mythology. and what we can actually learn or take from these sacred stories, especially when in relation to maybe sort of more on a metaphysical level, because that's also my original teachings or instruction, and how we can utilize these supposedly lessons or blessings or experiences to enhance our own existence here on this mortal plane. There is a popular sort of trend, maybe it's not a trend, but usage of dark goddesses in relation to the Jungian concept of shadow work. And if you're a little bit familiar with this or you're not, the shadow, you might have heard this word sort of used a lot, tends to represent, especially in Jungian psychology, those aspects about ourselves that we sort of like put in the back of our conscious or subconscious that we don't want to acknowledge or address or even admit that we have or we are capable of dealing with or doing or thinking. Usually thoughts or reactions or personality traits that form outside what our social norms determine as acceptable. So like the, I don't know, size 6 pair of jeans that I wore back in my 20s that are still in the back of my wardrobe, all these negative traits are shoved in the back of our subconscious and we ignore them. But they don't go away and they just seem to manifest and fester, and one day they might just, reintroduce themselves, often at the moment. Psychoanalyzing, NLP, all that sort of counseling work, where they can talk about your triggers or your root cause of issues. Often these things that we've shoved in the back of our subconscious mind. So the dark goddess is often associated with exploring these parts of ourselves that we've hidden deeply. In particular, there's one story that a lot of people use largely because of the symbolism, which is very powerful, and that's when it comes from ancient Sumeria, which is where I suppose modern Iraq, Iran is, and it's called the Descent of Inanna. And I won't go into the story now. I sort of talk a little bit in my book because I'm actually talking about Ishkagul, who is the goddess of the ruler of the Great Below, which is often utilized as the subconscious mind, and Inanna, who is us, moves through 7 gates, and there's lots of symbolism and so it's very in depth to actually get the most out of it. So there's many different approaches to working with the dark goddess. We can work it as an archetype, that's just a figment of mythology, or as I do with deity. I actually believe that they are real. I believe in deity and gods and goddesses, that they are actual real beings. They can be used as a focal point to help us address suppressed trauma, and they can also be sort of a guide at how we can vent our rage or the unsociable emotions that we tend to feel from time to time. And just as our experiences are very diverse, so are they. So my approach, as I've mentioned, has largely come through my interest in witchcraft mythology, work in sacred ceremony, and rituals. So to me, the dark goddess, if we're talking about a collective name for a being, I guess, can be perceived as archetypal energy, yet she is very much alive. So I suppose it's like with a lot of people who, especially in the sort of more earth-centric or pagan realms or goddess realms, we talk about goddess, god, almost as if there's a main being that's a god or a goddess, and then there's all these different other aspects or gods, separate gods and goddesses. And this is what I sort of talk about in my book, is that sometimes you can just talk about the dark goddess as a collective whole, but then there are also various other goddesses that are similar but different. And I think that can be a little bit confusing to anybody who's pretty new to this path. And what I mean by that is that how she manifests, like Kali or Sakmat or Hikarte or Ishkrakul or Nepsis or even Morgan and a Fae. These are all goddesses in their own rights, and they're all very separate to each other. From, I think it's Dion Fortune's The Sea Princess, or Sea Priestess, I should say, where she writes that all gods are one god, and all goddesses are one goddess, and there is one initiator. So again, this is up to different interpretations, and not everybody agrees with it. But when it comes to deity, I personally sort of follow a Taoist sort of pyramid, in that in the Taoist states that first there was the one, then there were the two, then there was 10,000. Or if you want to do the exact quote, I think it's the first 4 lines, well, no, it's the first 4 lines of the Taoist Ching. I've got it written down here. It says, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. From the one divine source, because we as humans work in polarity anyway. We have a masculine and feminine, and then it stems on from there. But we're all connected, if that makes any sense. So using Hekate or Hikarte as an example, she can be perceived as an aspect of Yin, the divine feminine, the goddess, yet she's very much also Tao, the original source herself, largely because her worshippers see her as the cosmic soul. And the same can be seen as Kali, who even within sort of like Hindu cultures, she's often a but then you have all the different layerings underneath as well. I don't know. And if you can see behind me, I'll get my, there we go, that's Kali, that a friend of mine, Sora Basilis, did, and she appeared in my book, and I should always mark the pages to show you some of the artwork in here, but I just can't find it off the top of my head, but that's all right. So I don't know how Kali first appeared in my life, or I first started this fascination that I do with her. I do recall that we have here in Adelaide an ashram run by a French guy who's at conjures, and learned how to keep an altar for her, although I don't do my practices as often as maybe I should. But I sort of have this weird fascination with her, and I see her probably as how the tantrics see her, as a ma. She is this mother figure, yet she is sort of a mother figure that I probably wouldn't push my luck and cross because of her, I don't know, volatile sort of nature. And likewise with the other goddesses that I sort of have a connection with, or who sort of pop into my life, in particular Nipsis, which is, not wrong one, there we go, one. She's the one who lives in the shadows. She's also the mother of Anubis, who is the god of the embalming. So she has this underworld characteristic as well. And I've always had a fascination with her, whether it's the twinning aspects between her and Isis, or just this unknown, or seemingly unknown, quality to her, which is quite interesting because originally, when we go back into ancient Egypt, she actually did have quite a large following. And then the other dark goddess that I sort of have a thing for is Ishkrikul, who I did sort of briefly mentioned earlier. And again, she sort of popped into my conscious awareness, so to speak, a number of years ago. Or to bring their stories into the modern consciousness, I don't know. But the result has been various workshops and now a book. So we'll just see what happens after that. Another point that I'd like to mention is, just because I'm talking about the goddess, the divine feminine, is probably don't think that because she's the divine feminine that she can only be reached by women. She's very acceptable for anybody. She doesn't judge anybody. She waits for anyone regardless of sex, gender, self-identification. She doesn't, well, my experience with her, she doesn't care about cultural lineage or heritage, age. Because Hinduism is a living religion, and how they worship their gods is done very often. There's a lot of devotion and there's a lot of sort of intent, which I find in a lot of other practices tends to, including paganism, tends to be missing. But that's just my perceptions. Deity, after all, is beyond human perceptions, and there's also a dark god as well. As I said, I've done an anthology called Call of the God, where it sort of included some aspects or dark aspects of the divine masculine, but I feel his energy different to that of the dark goddess. And yes, there is a book somewhere that will if you have any questions. I'm not an expert on everything, but I'm just going to continue waffling because I said I do have some notes. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments section now that I've worked out how to utilize it. And I'll see if I can address them or leave them there after this live recording, because I'll go back and see if there's anything that I can assist you with from there. So I'm just going to continue. So I've mentioned everybody has their own interpretation of the dark goddess or association as to what the dark goddess is, how she's presented, whether she is the sort of nightmare creature that's often depicted in Hollywood movies, in some books, and nice characteristic, very possibly. But what I have done for the purpose of tonight is sort of gathered together all these goddesses into different categories. And I think this sort of helps us to understand the whole concept of deity, in particular the darker deities. And I suppose you could do the same thing with light deities. At the end of the day, there's nothing, or no such thing as light or dark deity. The divine is just that. It's how we perceive them based on our culture, our upbringing, our fear factors, our own phobias and whatever. So I think I've got about 9 categories that I've put them in, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a few more. So let's have a look at some of them. The first one naturally will be Underworld Goddesses. So these goddesses actually reside with. Originally she was Kore, the maiden who was abducted by Hades. Now Hades' name actually means underworld. So when Kore marries Hades, she becomes Persephone, the queen of the underworld in her own right. And then, of course, she stays there after eating the pomegranate seeds for X amount of months per year. And we've also got Hikarte or Hekate, again from Greek myth, though her origins are a little bit unknown. And her connection with the underworld is that she's usually seen carrying the torches. So she's sort of like a psychopomp, can lead people in and out of the darkness. Then we have the Creatrix, or the creatrices of time and the world and the cosmos. The Kalik. Time, yet she's considered beyond time within the tantric traditions, and she's described as being dark of mind, body and soul. But this darkness isn't because it's bad or negative or evil. It just means a void beyond everything, the primordial creation. She's also the mysterious goddess of death and destruction, but we need death and destruction in order to create. She's a bit of a paradox. Then another goddess that I sort of have a fascination with is Tarmac from ancient Babylonian stories. And she's the primordial goddess of the sea, and she also represents chaos, and the chaos of primordial creation, because it was from her body that the heavens and earth. Scary per se, but they are still classified as dark goddesses. And who, through the sacred journeying or initiations of the young boy Gwan, or Gwinian, I think it's pronounced Gwinian, my Welsh isn't all that good, she teaches him in a way the various initiations, and then out at the end of the story came the creation of Taliesin, the greatest bard. Also in that part of the world, from Irish myth, we have a Scottish, or allegedly a Scottish goddess by the name of Scathach, which is quite interesting because Scottish myth, or I haven't found any Scottish myths that actually mention Scathach, but in the Irish myth, particularly around the hero Cuchulainn, it's to Scathach's island, which is actually the Isle of Skye, that he is sent to learn his figure, because, as I mentioned earlier, the dark goddess can be seen as one or many. So can the Morrigan. She can be seen as the Morrigan, the Battle Crow, the Phantom Queen. And then she's also seen as a title, where there's three very similar yet different goddesses that can be found usually stalking the Irish battlefields. They're often depicted as crows, and they sort of have that sort of death, rebirth, end of life, initiation aspect to them. And Kohola manages to upset a few of them, which is typical of this young hero. And then another goddess of initiation is Baba Yaga. In a pestle and mortar. So there's all this sort of mystical, magical aspects to her. And of course Vasilisa has the talking doll. Then we've got goddesses who are sort of associated with magic themselves. They're very mystical in their natures. Starting off with Nips, as I mentioned earlier, who's the younger sister of Isis, the mother of Anubis, who is the Egyptian psychopomp, guardian enchantress. And then from the British Isles again, Morgan Le Fay. And I've had some feedback, I include Morgan in my book, as to why she is a dark goddess, because a lot of people don't actually see her as a goddess at all. But I find her story really interesting because of all the mythologies, the Arthurian legend has long been one interest of mine, is that Morgan started off in the stories as a fairy queen, or one of 9 sisters known for their magical arts, and living on Avalon. And over time, as the story got told and retold, and the various people picking up different threads, she became very humanized to this point, or the last sort of recounting of her story as we know it today, where she seems other Ugrain and Glorious. So that was actually her cast, but she lost it, or she wasn't interested in it. She was also being taught or trained to take over as High Priestess of Avalon. Didn't want to do that. She fell in love, had the unacquainted love story with Lancelot, who went off and had his own unsuccessful love affair with Guinevere. But that sort of really impacted a lot on Morgan. She just never seemed to get her act together, get over it, and instead almost followed Lancelot around like a puppy dog, threw away her opportunities of being High Priestess of Avalon or ruler in her own right of Tintagel, to become a handmaiden, so to speak, of Guinevere, who actually treated her quite badly. So we're really looking at somebody who's really and that there's so much in their story that we can actually learn from. Yet, if we go back to her original story, she's such a powerful creature. So there's always this underpinning of the divine feminine, or the power of the divine feminine, that's been hidden, again, in the darkness. That's my interpretation anyway. Then we've got goddesses who will challenge our perceptions on sex, sexuality and sensuality, starting off, of course, with Lilith, who herself is a very interesting character as to, is she actually a goddess, even though the ancient sources never truly describe her as a goddess. She's always been seen first as a screech owl in ancient Babylonian texts. In the Bible, she wasn't really described as a goddess. She went off and retellings of the story being identified as mythologies that could be seen as dark goddesses, or have their stories tell us something, are the sirens. Again, they connect with sexuality and sensuality. The half-birds, usually half beautiful women, who tend to entice men, especially sailors, to their deaths through their singing. And this can be sort of likened to mermaids, again, often seen or originally depicted as half women, half fish with their tails. There's also the mermen, who don't get mentioned as much. And although the mermaids don't tend to so dark goddesses of war, in particular Durga from Hindu, Tiamat from ancient Egypt, goddess of war, destroyer of the enemies of Ra. And it's interesting that Sekhmet is actually associated with both disease as well as healing and medicine. So a lot of these goddesses, there's this sort of complex nature to them, and it's only through looking at their stories and, I suppose, of how I work with them, establishing a relationship that I'll talk about in a moment, that we begin to peel back the layers and understand, or start to understand, that there's more to them than what first meets the eye. There's also goddesses associated who is the goddess of divine retribution, who meted out her punishment for the gods. So she's really truly smited her enemies. There's bringers of change, whether we want it or not, such as Oya from the African or Voodoo traditions, a powerful warrior queen, sister wife of Shango. She's also connected with thunder, lightning, tornadoes, strong winds, rainstorms, hurricanes. And it's often seeing her winds of change come through and really blow heck in our lives. And Kali, who I've mentioned before. This goddess is associated with the unknown and death, and the underworld, who also, she's depicted as having one side of her face flesh, the other side skeleton. And she's the one who sort of retrieves the dead who have fallen and were not worthy of going to Valhalla. And so she also sort of picks up the unwanted. We have Madame Bridget as well, who's actually connected with the cemeteries in the Hindu religion. And there's also, I think, Chandra, I have to double check, I haven't got it in the notes, who's actually one of the aspects of Kali, but she is the Skeletor, and she's actually seen as just a skeleton, often depicted in very similar poses to Kali, especially when she's mounting Lord Shiva. We have dark goddesses who stalk our nightmares. Like surprise there. But both Kata, and she's another aspect of the Morrigan when the Morrigans uses a title, and her name means battle crow. And the Babe Kata is said to cause fear and confusion amongst the soldiers in order to move the tide of battle into her favour. So she doesn't play nice when it comes to the war. We've got the Banshees as well, and there's also aspects of Hikarte that can be extremely challenging and appear in our nightmares. And even today there are various sort of strands or pockets of, I suppose, belief or worship who see Hikarte in this very sort of underworldly, terrifying, nightmare-ish perception. So that's, I think, about 9 various aspects that I personally course on the Dark Goddess itself. I'm hoping it will actually expand into a number of courses. It's just taken me forever to do, and I'm hoping to, I think I've got one more video to record and then 6 parts, so I should be able to upload it. So that would just be sort of an introduction to the Dark Goddess, how she came about, and how I personally work with her, or work with, say, Kali in particular. Just giving a few ideas, and then we can take it from there. And details will be sort of mentioned through various social media feeds, etc., on here, on my web pages when it's ready. Likewise, I have a month-long the Dark Goddess that you can actually work with for over that period of time and actually establish a relationship, because that's how I work. I find it very beneficial to actually start establishing a relationship with, say, one particular aspect of the divine, if it's God, Goddess, dark, light, whatever, and then it's almost like making a new best friend. And then when there's times which are low or confusing for you, you've got someone you can actually turn to. And one of my practices that I like doing, and maybe this is why I've got this connection with Kali, is the mantra. I'm not Hindu, but I find through that chanting that helps calm the physical, the conscious mind down. consciousness, or you see it externally as in deity. That's entirely up to you. But often we get too caught up in the head, and we need to sort of like calm that down so we can let the heart or the higher mind to come through. So those are the two things that I'm hoping to have out this year. One will be happening, the Sadhana will be happening on the 22nd of October. It's online. Yeah, so you can access it anywhere in the world. And then also the course, and hopefully that'll be uploaded at some stage before Christmas. I can't make any promises. I have had a few comments about goddesses that aren't included in Encountering the Dark Goddess. I only had room for 13 goddesses, and yes, I am, along with a dark god, I don't think anybody's asked any questions. Or I want to share a quote from Emma Ristol Orr, and this was found in her book Kissing the Hag, the Dark Goddess and the Unacceptable Nature of Women. And I like this quote because it sort of resonates to how I perceive Kali. And she writes, "The Dark Goddess, the primordial aspect of deity, birthed us. By her touch she woken the darkness within our own souls, allowing us to perceive and reflect on the things around us. For without this reverence we are lost. Science informs us that our planet circles a sun star, which we rely on for light and heat. It is little wonder, then, that religions focus on the light. Yet we are afraid of the dark." And I think that's really important to sort of think about, because this is sort of how the Hindu tantrics see Kali, that she is beyond time, yet she created time. And it also depicts the shadowy nature of the goddess that we have been trained to ignore. Being like moths to a flame, we've been told to look at the light, and at times the light blinds us. And I think some of us even know that we need the darkness. We need the don't normally see, because we have so much light pollution, and we probably don't realise it. I grew up on a farm in New Zealand, and I could always see the Milky Way. Here in suburbia, in Adelaide's not all that big, really, but with 24-hour lighting, you can see very few stars at all, and I haven't seen the Milky Way in such a long time. And we need silence in the darkness. Yet people these days are almost getting scared of the dark, scared of silence. They need to have that stimulation all the time. But it doesn't do us any good, us as in these living cellular beings. We need rest for our souls to regenerate, for us to unwire, unhook ourselves. just to listen. And once we move away from the head stuff, those voices in our head, and go past that, then we can find the true source and connection with our soul. And yeah, for some people that is scary. That is the demons of Hollywood movies. That is frightening. But that, to me, is what the Dark Goddesses do. They encourage us. They help us. They remind us to sit. That's what Hikarte did to Nana. 3 days, 3 nights in the underworld. Made her sit and look at her own self. Anywhere, you can even send it to me and I can send it off to my publisher. Because in the writing world, even though I've got 7 books out, I'm still an unknown. And I do also think that this sort of work, this exploration, is very important, more so in this our modern day and age. So reviews help to sell books, which means authors like myself kind of lifts our profile up, and especially with Moon Books being a little family English company, we're sort of going up against the big guns like Llewellyn in America. And if you're interested in maybe exploring the Dark Goddesses a little bit more, as I said, I'll just keep an eye out on my social media feeds for the online Sadhana and also the workshop. And yes, so again, thank you for